Hello! September is over, and you know what that means? It is time for my end of September reading wrap-up. I read 4 books in the month of September, and 3 of them were in the exact same series, so mostly this vlog will be covering the Discovery of Witches / All Souls series by Deborah Harkness. This is not my first time reading this series, but I haven't read it in many years. I read the first book back in 2011 or 2012, I believe, so it's been a long time. And the reason why I decided to reread this series this month is because they finally added the TV show onto Netflix, and when the TV show first came out a couple years ago, I did watch season 1 and about half of season 2 and then never finished and never picked it back up. But then once they added it very easily and accessibly to Netflix, I decided to rewatch it, and that is what reignited the hyperfixation where I immediately needed to go and reread the books and just forget about everything else I had on my reading list for the month. So that's why this kind of took over the month of September. So if you don't know, A Discovery of Witches is a kind of magical realism series that has romance, science, history, alchemy. So while the plot itself is pretty simple, all of the details around the plot and the world building and the kind of historical nature of the vampires, the witches, and the demons and how the science revolves around their lives is pretty complicated, and it makes sense because the author has her PhD in history and she's literally a professor, so the way she writes tends to lean a little bit more academic, and if that is not really your forte, then I think you will find the books to be rather undigestible, especially the second one. Even I struggle a little bit with the second one because it takes place in the 1590s, which is the author's period of study, and so I obviously, rightfully so, she's kind of like, yeah, I want to show you all how much I know about the 1590s, but as a non-historian, it does get a little intense. So I'm going to start with talking about the first book. That's kind of a general overview of the vibe of the series. I know that this book also has kind of a lot of haters on the internet, and I understand why people don't like it. I think the relationship between Diana and Matthew, which is kind of the focus of the book, about a witch who ends up calling up an ancient alchemical manuscript accidentally that now all these vampires, demons, and witches all want because apparently it tells the secret behind their creation, and since all of their powers are kind of fading as time goes on, they all want to figure out how to fix this or gain more power over the other creatures. And she ends up recalling this ancient manuscript and teams up with Matthew the vampire because he's a scientist and he's been researching this and is pretty much the only one who doesn't want to just like take advantage of her and her talents right off the bat. So they end up getting swept up in this whirlwind romance and journey that's all tied to the secrets behind the Book of Life, and that is what they're trying to uncover. And because Matthew is like a 1500-year-old vampire, you know, he has some, I would say, non-modern views, which his son, vampire son, Marcus, tends to tease him about quite frequently during the books. And I think it's managed pretty well because Diana is so strong-willed and does not put up with a fair amount of his BS. And so it doesn't really bother me that much, even though in most books I can't stand like overly protective, non-modern, progressive men. But in this series, it has never really bothered me because it's integrated into the plot and the world building so well that it feels authentic and not just forced for some sort of fulfillment of romantic tropes, if that makes sense. And I think the first book is by far my favorite in this whole series. Getting to see Diana and Matthew's relationship develop, the first few chapters of the book taking place at Oxford University in the fall, the vibes, the atmosphere, everything is just screaming the perfect fall read, especially with witches and vampires and demons roaming about. And you also get introduced to a lot of my most favorite characters in the series, namely Matthew's vampire mother, Isabeau de Clermont, who lives alone. Well, not alone, she lives with her vampire servant in France, and at first she's very cold and pretty hard to, you know, crack her exterior, but as the series develops, she ends up being a hilarious character. And there is one of my favorite scenes in the entire series is in the third book between her and one of the other vampires. Basically, she's teaching him how to use a computer, and in teaching him how to use a computer, she is just stealing all of his information, which it's just written in a very funny way. So really, my love for this just boils down partly to the romance, but also partly the way that alchemy and science and history is so perfectly interwoven interwoven into the plot. It's just super interesting to read about, and you feel like you actually learn a lot, especially in book 2, which is the second book that I read in September, Shadow of Night, where Matthew and Diana go back to the 1590s and meet a lot of Matthew's old friends, because if you've ever heard of the historical School of Night, which is actually a real thing, there's a lesser known member of the School of Night named Matthew Royden, and in this universe, Matthew Claremont is actually Matthew Royden, so it's kind of an interesting twist on that mysterious historical figure. But you get to meet like Queen Elizabeth and Christopher Marlowe, a little bit of Shakespeare, Lord Northumberland or Duke Northumberland or some Northumberland. And I find it kind of difficult to keep all of these characters straight. Honestly, that is one of my least favorite parts of this book, is anything that takes place with the School of Night. I just don't find those characters to be that engaging. Christopher Marlowe, aka Kit, is probably the only one that has any real character interest to me. The rest of them are just interchangeable and I don't really care about them. But then the best part of this book is definitely in the middle, when Matthew and Diana go to Septours again in France in the past, and they meet Philippe, who is Isabeau's husband, and he is dead in the present. So this is the first time that you get to meet him, even though he's talked about a lot, and the way that he kind of develops Matthew and Diana's relationship is very authentic and necessary, and that is definitely the best stretch of chapters in the book and the best part of season 2 of the show by far. So it did take me a while to read the second book. I think I read the first book in 3 days, even though it's 550 pages, and then the second book took me a good 2 weeks. So in between the second and the third book, I changed it up, but I'm gonna finish talking about the third book before I get into my last read of the month. I think the Book of Life does a really good job of wrapping up the whole series. I'm going to give a spoiler because a lot of this has been kind of spoilery, and I figure most people don't really care, but if you care, there's a spoiler. Diana and Matthew have twins in this book because she gets pregnant at the end of Shadow of Night, and in this book she gives birth to the twins. And I understand the twins' birth from kind of a plot standpoint, because it does tie into the alchemy and the science of this world and the creatures, and it explains kind of a lot of stuff about the mystery that we've seen since the first book. But I just don't really like the children at all in this book. I don't really feel the like connection between Diana and Matthew and the kids just kind of always has felt a little disjointed to me. Even though we're in Diana's head, they just don't really feel like her children. I don't know how else to describe it. Obviously I've never had kids, but I feel like I've read a lot of books where people have kids and it's described like much better than it is here. I just didn't really like feel like it was an authentic character beat for her, I guess. I don't know. I don't completely know how to explain it, but it's never been my favorite part of the series. But I think it's wrapped up really well. A lot of the characters that we knew and loved in the last 2 books kind of all come together to remove the covenant, which forbids cross-species relationships. And yeah, I think it's a good conclusion to the series, and I definitely think I will reread those books again sometime, maybe in the next 10 years, since it took me 10 years to reread them in the first place. Alright, moving on to something different. The 4th book that I read in the month of September, which I actually read between Shadow of Night and Book of Life, is my book club book for this month, and that was Middle of the Night by Riley Sager. I've only read one other Riley Sager book, and that was the only one left, and I actually really liked that. There was one twist at the end that I hated. Like, I really liked it, and then there was one final twist that I just felt went a little bit too far, and the book would have been perfectly great and amazing even without that final twist, and that just felt like a pure shock value addition. So I didn't really have like amazing expectations going into this, because I feel like all Riley Sager thrillers are just kind of good but not great. That seems to be the general public consensus, and that is how I felt about this one. I gave it 3 stars. It was fine. His books are engaging, they're easy to get through, they're entertaining, but in the end it's something special and it's something that I think about afterward. This basically follows a character named Ethan, who when he was a kid in the 90s, he was camping in his backyard. There's like this cul-de-sac basically of a bunch of houses, maybe 6 or 7 houses, and it's a very quiet, remote area with forests behind, and he was camping in the backyard with his best friend, and his best friend got taken from the tent and just vanished, and he has never heard from him since. sense. So now that his parents moved out, he's returning as an adult to take over the house, and obviously that's bringing back a bunch of memories and problems with the fact that his friend had vanished, because a lot of the same people that were living there back then are still living here now. So it kind of flashes back and forth between the past and the future, and things get a little bit paranormal because Ethan's friend who vanished was obsessed with ghosts and the paranormal. So the whole time you're kind of unsure whether all the strange events that are happening are real or whether it's actually going to be like a paranormal twist. You don't really know. And a lot of those secrets all bog down to the fact that there is a place called the Hemlock Institute, which is deep into the woods, and some of the people on the circle work there, but you're not really sure what they actually do at the Hemlock Institute. But Ethan is kind of convinced that it has to do with the disappearance of his friend. So it's basically just about him trying to then go back and solve that disappearance. And I was not super thrilled with the ending. I understand why it was written the way that it was, and I can appreciate it from like a craft kind of standpoint or like a subversion of expectation, but it was just not that satisfying to me. And I felt like there were so many loopholes where, you know, I've watched a lot of detective TV where I'm immediately like, wait, but what about this? What about this? What about this? It just felt like it actually created more questions than it solved, because I just could not find it to be believable at all, the event that actually got explained about what happened. So it was fine. At first it was giving me like Desperate Housewives energy, and I did love the kind of vintage 90s vibe, but it unfortunately kind of fell off a little bit in the middle and didn't really continue with that same energy. So yeah, that is everything that I read in the month of September. Obviously most of this was about a discovery of witches, and it's hard to do a review, I feel like, of a series as opposed to one individual book, because when it's the first book in the series or it's a standalone, I can very easily talk about the plot without giving spoilers. But when I'm talking about books 2 and 3, it's like you kind of have to know the first book already to be interested in what I'm saying about the next 2 books. So I apologize if I did not do a very good job of making this interesting for people who have not read that series, but I'm being honest, this is what I read in September. So yeah, see you next month.